While entire crews died of scurvy and starvation, one pirate's men stayed healthy for months on end. No ice, no magic, just one ridiculously simple trick that defied every law of nature sailors believed in. How was this even possible? When most people think about pirates, they picture treasure chests overflowing with gold doubloons and glittering jewels. But here's what those Hollywood movies won't tell you. The real treasure that kept pirates alive wasn't buried on some remote island. It was sitting right there in their ship's hold, looking as plain as your grandmother's kitchen cabinet. Salt. Not the fancy stuff you sprinkle on your French fries, mind you. We're talking about coarse white crystals that pirates would literally kill for. Why? Because without salt, every piece of meat on their ship would turn into a rotting, maggot-infested nightmare faster than you could say, "Shiver me timbers." Think about it this way. You complain when your leftovers go bad after 3 days in the fridge. These guys were stuck on wooden boats for months without so much as an ice cube. Salt was their refrigerator, their freezer, and their life insurance policy all rolled into one. The process was brutally simple. Pirates would pack fresh meat, beef, pork, whatever they could get their hands on, in layers of salt so thick it looked like a Minnesota snowbank. The salt worked like a moisture vampire, sucking every drop of water out of the meat. No moisture meant no bacteria. No bacteria meant no death by food poisoning. But here's where it gets interesting. Smart captains knew something that would make modern treasure hunters weep. They'd often choose raiding salt mines over attacking gold-laden merchant ships. Sounds crazy? Well, gold doesn't keep you from starving to death in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A typical pirate ship would haul around a full ton of salt. That's about the weight of a small car, just in salt. The crew treated those white crystals like they were made of platinum. And honestly, when you're facing months of endless ocean with nothing but hardtack and whatever fish you could catch, salt was more valuable than any crown jewel. Of course, there was a catch. Isn't there always? All that salt turned their food into something harder than a lone shark's heart. Sailors used to joke that their salted beef could double as cannonballs during sea battles. The irony was delicious, if you'll pardon the pun. Here they were, surrounded by water everywhere they looked, but eating food so salty it left them desperately thirsty. The salt worked, though. It kept meat edible for months, which was nothing short of miraculous for the time. But salt wasn't the only weapon in their preservation arsenal. While salt was doing its preservative magic, pirates discovered another game-changing technique that would make their food last even longer. And this one came with a bonus. It actually made everything taste better, too. Smoking meat and fish over slow-burning fires became the pirate's secret weapon against spoilage. Unlike your weekend barbecue where you're rushing to get dinner on the table, these sea-hardened sailors had all the time in the world. They'd hang strips of meat and fish over smoldering coals for hours, sometimes days, creating a protective barrier that bacteria couldn't penetrate. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirates weren't exactly known for following recipe books, were they? They adapted old European village techniques to work on cramped, rocking ships where one wrong move could set the entire vessel ablaze. Talk about high-stakes cooking. The process worked like nature's own shrink wrap. Smoke contains natural chemicals that act as preservatives, while the slow heat removes moisture, the enemy of fresh food. It's basically giving your dinner a protective coat of armor, except this armor happens to taste incredible. Now, using fire on a wooden ship filled with gunpowder and rum barrels, that took some serious courage, or maybe just desperation. The risk was sky high, but so was the reward of having edible meals months into their voyage instead of chewing on leather boots. These resourceful sea rogues would catch fish in tropical waters and immediately string them up under makeshift smoking areas below deck. The result? Food that could outlast even the longest treasure hunt, with flavors so distinctive that today's barbecue masters would tip their hats in respect. But smoking wasn't just about preservation, it became a culinary art form by accident. Pirates unknowingly created flavor profiles that would inspire countless dishes for centuries to come. Who knew that necessity could be such a brilliant cooking teacher? The beauty of this method was its flexibility. Got some extra fish? Smoke it. Managed to catch a wild pig on that last island stop? Into the smoke it goes. Everything from beef to pork to whatever unfortunate sea creature crossed their path got the royal smoking treatment. Yet even with smoking working wonders, smart pirate captains knew they needed more tricks up their sleeves. Because when you're facing months at sea with no guarantee of finding fresh supplies, having just one preservation method isn't enough. They needed something that could add variety to their diet while keeping food safe to eat. Something that would literally pickle their taste buds. Pirates discovered something most landlubbers never figured out. Vinegar could stop time. Well, not literally, but it sure felt that way when your pickled vegetables still tasted fresh after 3 months at sea. Here's the genius part. Vinegar creates an acidic environment so hostile that bacteria basically throw up their tiny hands and surrender. It's like creating a moat around your food, except instead of keeping out medieval knights, you're keeping out the microscopic army trying to turn your dinner into green mush. The clever sea dogs didn't waste money on fancy containers either. Those empty rum barrels, perfect pickle factories, wine casks that had seen better days, outstanding brine holders. Pirates were the original recycling champions, long before anyone made it trendy. They'd clean out these barrels faster than a politician changes positions during election season. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirates would pickle absolutely everything they could get their weathered hands on. Vegetables, eggs, even meat if they were feeling adventurous. Some crews developed reputations for their pickle game. Captain Morgan's men were supposedly famous for pickled fish that could make grown sailors weep tears of joy. The process itself was surprisingly sophisticated for a bunch of guys who thought bathing was optional. They'd layer their food in barrels, cover it with vinegar or salt brine, then seal it tighter than their lips when questioned about buried treasure. The acid did all the heavy lifting, creating an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. Now, there was a downside. Pickled food packed a sour punch that could make your face scrunch up like you'd just been told the tavern ran out of ale. New crew members would take their first bite of pickled cabbage and look like they'd been slapped by a wet fish. But after weeks of the same bland hardtack, that tangy kick became a welcome surprise. The smart captains understood something crucial. Variety prevented mutiny. A crew eating the same flavorless mush day after day might start eyeing the captain's quarters with unfriendly intentions. But throw in some pickled onions or preserved cucumbers, and suddenly you've got sailors who remember why they signed up for adventure instead of farming. Some ships became floating pickle empires. Barrels lined up like soldiers, each one a time capsule of preserved goodness. The aroma below deck could knock you sideways, but that smell meant survival. Then there's the question of storage space. Smart pirates learned that proper container management could make or break a voyage, and they developed techniques that would make modern storage experts jealous. Those wooden barrels you see in every pirate movie, they weren't just props gathering dust in the corner. These oak masterpieces were basically the refrigerators of the high seas, and without them, most pirates would have starved before they could say, "Ahoy, matey." Here's what most people don't realize about barrel storage. The wood itself fought a constant battle against moisture and salt air. Oak barrels weren't chosen randomly. They were selected like a picky mother-in-law choosing china. The tight grain of oak wood naturally resisted water penetration, while the curved construction created an airtight seal that kept oxygen from spoiling the contents. But the real genius was in the layering system. Smart pirates didn't just toss meat into barrels like dirty laundry into a hamper. They created what I call the pirate parfait, alternating layers of salted meat with dried herbs and sometimes even clean cloth. This prevented the pieces from sticking together and created air pockets that helped preserve individual portions. The coopers who made these barrels were worth their weight in gold doubloons. Pirates often kidnapped skilled barrel makers faster than they'd snatch actual treasure. Makes sense, right? A leaky barrel meant ruined food, and ruined food meant mutiny. I'd rather face a dozen angry sailors with cutlasses than one hangry crew demanding dinner. Then there's the size factor. A standard ship's barrel held about 60 gallons, roughly equivalent to feeding 30 men for a week. The math was crucial because space on ships was tighter than a miser's purse strings. Every square inch counted, so barrels were designed to stack efficiently and double as furniture when needed. Well, the downside was obvious. One crack in the wood, one loose metal hoop, and months of carefully preserved food could turn into a slimy, inedible mess faster than you could say Blackbeard. Pirates developed a paranoid habit of checking barrel seals daily. tapping them like a doctor checking reflexes. The most experienced quartermasters could tell the condition of stored food just by the sound a barrel made when knocked. A dull thud meant trouble. A clean, hollow ring meant dinner was still safe. And the weird part is, these same barrels often held rum, wine, or fresh water in their previous lives. Pirates weren't picky about recycling. They'd scrub out a whiskey barrel and fill it with beef jerky without batting an eye. But even the best barrel storage had its limits, and smart captains knew that controlling how much food each crew member ate was just as important as keeping it fresh. Now here's where pirates got really clever and desperate. When you're floating in the middle of nowhere with a crew of hungry sailors who'd happily feed you to the sharks if the food ran out, rationing wasn't just smart planning. It was survival. Most people think pirates just grabbed food and ate until their bellies burst. Wrong! These guys were like accountants with cutlasses, carefully calculating every morsel. A typical pirate captain would divide provisions into daily portions that could stretch for months. Kind of like my grandmother during the Great Depression, except with more rum and fewer doilies. The standard daily ration: 1 pound of salted meat, 1 pound of hardtack biscuits, and a pint of beer or rum. Sounds generous until you realize that hardtack had the consistency of roof shingles and about as much flavor. But hey, it kept you alive. Smart captains used what they called the thirds rule. 1/3 of provisions for the planned voyage, 1/3 for delays and storms, and 1/3 for emergencies. Makes sense, right? Well, unless you're dealing with pirates who could eat a horse and still ask for dessert. The real genius was in psychology. Instead of letting crew members grab food whenever they wanted, which would have lasted about as long as a chocolate teapot, captains appointed a quartermaster to distribute rations. This guy was basically the food police, and trust me, nobody messed with him. But here's the weird part. Pirates actually ate better than most sailors on merchant or navy ships. Why? Because they weren't feeding shareholders back home. They were feeding themselves. Revolutionary thinking for the 1600s. When supplies ran low, captains would implement short rations, half portions, watered-down beer, and hardtack so stale it could double as armor plating. Crews grumbled, but they understood the math. Starve a little now, or starve completely later. The quartermaster would mark each day's consumption on a wooden tally stick. No fancy ledgers, just notches in wood. Simple, but effective. Like keeping score in the world's deadliest game of, will we make it to the next port? Some crews got creative with their meager portions. They'd pool resources to make communal stews, stretching ingredients further than a yoga instructor. Others would gamble their rations in card games, because apparently risking starvation made the stakes more interesting. And then there's what happened when even the best rationing wasn't enough. When desperation drove these sea dogs to try preservation methods that sounded absolutely impossible. Pirates stumbled onto one of nature's most clever tricks completely by accident. Well, sort of. When your hardtack gets soggy and starts bubbling, most folks would toss it overboard. But desperate sailors, they took a bite anyway and discovered something magical. Fermentation turned potential disasters into edible gold. The process works like having a tiny workforce of beneficial bacteria fighting off the bad guys. These microscopic heroes would feast on sugars and starches, producing acids that made food hostile to spoilage. It's like hiring the world's smallest security team. But here's where it gets interesting. Pirates didn't just stumble onto sauerkraut by chance. Those crafty sea dogs learned from every port they pillaged. German techniques, Asian methods, Caribbean tricks. They collected preservation secrets like other folks collected coins. Sauerkraut became their secret weapon against scurvy. One captain reportedly kept barrels of fermented cabbage that lasted 8 months without refrigeration. 8 months. That's longer than some modern relationships. The vitamin C packed in those tangy leaves kept crews healthier than Navy sailors eating proper rations. Then there's the booze angle. Pirates weren't just drinking for fun, though they certainly enjoyed that part. Fermented ales and wines stayed safe to drink when water barrels turned green with algae. The alcohol content killed nasties that would otherwise send sailors running for the ship's rail. The smell, though, that's another story entirely. Imagine being stuck below deck with 50 other unwashed pirates and barrels of fermenting everything. The aroma could probably knock a seagull unconscious at 20 paces. But funny thing about desperate hunger, It makes you appreciate flavors you'd never consider on land. Smart captains learn to manage fermentation like conducting an orchestra. Too little time and you're eating raw cabbage. Too much and you've got alcoholic vegetables that leave the crew useless during battles. The sweet spot required timing that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous. Some crews got so good at fermentation they could turn almost anything edible. Fruits, vegetables, even fish in some cases. One legendary pirate cook allegedly fermented turtle eggs that stayed fresh for 3 months. Whether that's true or just sailors' tales depends on who's buying the rum. The real genius? Fermented foods actually improved with time. Unlike salted meat that got harder than cannonballs, fermented provisions developed complex flavors that made ship meals almost enjoyable, almost being the key word there. But even the cleverest fermentation tricks couldn't prepare pirates for what happened when supplies ran completely out. That's when true innovation kicked in. When your food supplies are running dangerously low and land is nowhere in sight, what separates the survivors from the starved? Pure creative genius. Pirates weren't just raiders, they were the ultimate problem solvers. These seafaring rogues collected preservation techniques like they collected treasure, picking up methods from every port, culture, and desperate situation they encountered. A Spanish technique here, a Caribbean trick there, maybe something borrowed from those Dutch merchants they'd liberated last month. Take sun drying, for instance. Pirates discovered that tropical sunshine could work miracles on fresh catches. They'd string fish along the rigging like maritime Christmas decorations, letting the blazing sun do what expensive smoking equipment couldn't. The result? Jerky that lasted months and tasted better than you'd expect from something that looked like leather boots. But here's where things get interesting. When regular methods failed, desperation bred innovation faster than rats in the hold. Some crews learned to wrap meat in seaweed before storing it in barrels. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that salty ocean vegetation created an extra protective barrier against decay. It was like giving your food a natural raincoat, one that actually worked. Others discovered the magic of layering different preserved foods together. They'd alternate between salted pork, dried beans, and pickled vegetables in the same container. Each layer protected the others, creating a preservation ecosystem that kept everything fresher longer. These guys accidentally invented the concept of smart storage centuries before anyone coined the term. The really clever captains started mixing techniques in ways that would make modern food scientists jealous. They'd smoke fish, then pickle it, then wrap it in those protective leaves. Triple insurance against hunger. Because when you're 3 months from the nearest tavern, overkill becomes survival. And get this, some pirates figured out how to use their ship's natural rocking motion to help with food preparation. They'd secure containers of ingredients and let the ocean's movement do the mixing for them. Free labor, courtesy of Mother Nature herself. The best part? These innovations weren't written down in fancy cookbooks. They were passed along through whispered conversations between trusted crew members, shared over rum-soaked evenings like state secrets. Each successful technique became part of the ship's unofficial survival manual. These creative combinations and unexpected methods kept crews fed when conventional wisdom said they should be starving. But among all these clever innovations, one captain developed something so effective, so surprisingly simple, that other pirates refused to believe it worked, until they saw the impossible results for themselves. Well, the pirate world had its share of legends, but Captain Mordecai Iron Belly Blackwell earned his reputation through something far more valuable than sword skills. His crew could sail for 4 months without touching port, while other ships started dropping sailors from scurvy after 6 weeks. What made Blackwell different? The man figured out something that would make modern food scientists scratch their heads in amazement. Here's where it gets interesting. Blackwell discovered that certain tropical leaves, specifically banana and plantain leaves, contained natural compounds that acted like tiny shields against bacteria. But he didn't just wrap food and call it a day. That would have been too simple for a pirate who once outsmarted the entire Spanish fleet using nothing but fog and attitude. His method involved creating what he called layered fortresses inside his barrels. First layer, salt-cured meat. Second layer, those magical leaves. Third layer, more meat. Fourth layer, more leaves. He'd repeat this process until the barrel looked like a giant green and brown sandwich that could feed 20 hungry pirates. The leaves released natural oils that created an antimicrobial environment. Think of it like having a bouncer at a club. Except the bouncer is made of vegetation, and the troublemakers are tiny organisms trying to spoil your dinner. But here's the kicker. Blackwell took it one step further. He'd char the inside of his barrels slightly before packing them. Not enough to damage the wood, just enough to create a carbon layer that absorbed excess moisture. The combination of charcoal absorption, leaf oils, and traditional salting created something revolutionary. Other captains thought he was completely mad. Wasting perfectly good barrel space on leaves? What's next? Packing flowers for the rats? Yet when those same captains were rationing moldy hardtack, Blackwell's crew was enjoying meat that tasted like it was preserved yesterday. The charred barrel walls prevented moisture buildup while the leaves fought off decay. Meanwhile, the salt kept doing its traditional heavy lifting. The downside? This method required about 20% more storage space. Plus, finding the right leaves meant making strategic stops at specific islands. Not exactly convenient when you're being chased by naval forces. Legend says Blackwell once preserved beef so perfectly using this technique that it lasted 8 months. When they finally opened that last barrel off the coast of Madagascar, the meat was so fresh, his cook assumed they'd taken on supplies the previous week. The secret died with Blackwell during a particularly heated disagreement with a Spanish galleon. But his innovation proved that sometimes the most impossible tricks come from combining old wisdom with creative desperation.